Picture this. You're standing in front of your entire school, holding a black garbage bag that your worst enemies want you to wear as a dress. The whole gymnasium is watching, waiting to see you crumble. Your heart is pounding so hard you can hear it in your ears. This is the moment that will define everything. Do you put on the bag and let them win, or do you find a strength you never knew you had? What happened next shocked everyone in that room, including the girl herself. This is the incredible true story of Emma Collins and how 35 seconds changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain pelted against the windows of Lincoln High School as Emma Collins pressed her back against the cold metal lockers, watching the river of students flow past her like she was invisible, which honestly was exactly how she preferred it. Her brown hair fell like a curtain across her face, partially hiding the anxious expression that had become her permanent mask over the past year. She clutched her worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird against her chest like armor, the familiar weight of the book providing the only comfort she could find in this place that felt more like a battlefield than a school. The whispers started before she even reached her first period English class. She could hear fragments of conversations floating through the air like poisonous butterflies. There she goes again, trying to blend into the walls. Remember when she totally froze on stage? So embarrassing. I heard she can't even order food without having a panic attack. Each word felt like a small needle pricking at her already fragile confidence. But Emma had learned to keep walking, keep breathing, keep surviving one day at a time. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time, not so long ago, when Emma Collins had been a different person entirely. She remembered being 8 years old, fearlessly climbing trees in her backyard while her father cheered her on from below. She remembered being 12 and eagerly raising her hand in every class, confident that her thoughts and ideas mattered. She remembered being 14 and actually looking forward to school, to seeing her friends, to participating in activities that made her feel alive and connected to the world around her. But that girl felt like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime entirely. The transformation had been gradual at first, like a slow leak in a tire that you don't notice until you're stranded on the side of the road. It started when her father packed his bags one rainy Tuesday morning, explaining in his gentle but tired voice that sometimes adults made mistakes and that he needed to find himself somewhere else. Emma had watched from her bedroom window as his car disappeared around the corner, taking with it the stability and security that had anchored her entire world. Her mother, Sarah, had tried to hold everything together with the determination of someone who refused to let life defeat her. Family. She worked double shifts at the law firm, where she was a paralegal, coming home exhausted, but still managing to help Emma with homework and listen to her fears about the divorce. But even Sarah's unwavering strength couldn't protect Emma from the way the world suddenly felt dangerous and unpredictable. If her own father could simply walk away from everything they'd built together, what else in her life might disappear without warning? The real breaking point came during the spring talent show of her sophomore year. Emma had been passionate about poetry since middle school, writing verses that captured her feelings about everything, from first crushes to environmental conservation. Her English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had encouraged her to share one of her poems about resilience and hope at the annual student showcase. For weeks, Emma had practiced in front of her bedroom mirror, perfecting every line and gesture until she felt ready to inspire her classmates with words that came straight from her heart. But when the moment arrived and she walked onto that brightly lit stage, something inside her completely shattered. The sea of faces in the auditorium suddenly looked like a jury waiting to deliver a guilty verdict. Her carefully memorized words evaporated from her mind like morning mist. leaving behind only a terrifying blankness. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 3 minutes, opening and closing her mouth like a fish gasping for air, while hundreds of students and parents watched in uncomfortable silence. The tears came without warning, hot and shameful, streaming down her cheeks as she finally gave up and ran off the stage. But the humiliation didn't end there. Someone in the audience had been recording the entire disaster on their phone, and by Monday morning, the video of Statue Girl's epic fail had been shared so many times that even teachers were talking about it in hushed, sympathetic tones that somehow made everything worse. From that moment forward, Emma became a ghost haunting the hallways of Lincoln High. She developed elaborate strategies for avoiding attention, sitting in the back corner of every classroom, taking routes through less crowded corridors, eating lunch in empty classrooms or the library, where the noise and chaos of the cafeteria couldn't overwhelm her already fragile nervous system. Her grades remained solid because homework didn't require speaking aloud, but class participation dropped to 0, and her teachers began writing concerned notes on her report cards about her reluctance to engage with the learning community. The anxiety had become a constant companion, a weight that settled on her chest each morning and followed her through every interaction. Simple tasks that other students took for granted became monumental challenges. Ordering food at the school cafeteria required careful planning and deep breathing exercises. Asking to use the bathroom in the middle of class felt like requesting permission to climb Mount Everest. Group projects were torture sessions, where she would do all the work herself, rather than risk the vulnerability of collaborating with classmates who might judge her every word and gesture. Her mother watched this transformation with the helpless frustration of someone trying to save a drowning person who keeps pushing away the life preserver. Sarah arranged therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez, a kind woman who specialized in adolescent anxiety disorders. And while the weekly meetings provided some coping strategies, they couldn't undo the fundamental fear that had taken root in Emma's heart. The fear that she was fundamentally flawed, that her thoughts and feelings were somehow less valid than everyone else's, that speaking up would only invite more judgment and rejection. Dr. Martinez had explained that social anxiety often developed as a protective mechanism, a way for the mind to shield itself from perceived threats by avoiding situations that might lead to criticism or rejection. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Your brain is trying to keep you safe, she had said during one of their sessions, but it's being overprotective. Like a parent who won't let their child leave the house because they're afraid something bad might happen. Emma understood the logic, but understanding something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two completely different things. The irony wasn't lost on her that she came from a family of strong, articulate women. Her mother had built a successful career in law by advocating for people who couldn't advocate for themselves, using her voice as a tool for justice and change. Her grandmother had been a teacher who inspired generations of students to find their own voices and pursue their dreams with confidence. But somehow, Emma had inherited all of their intelligence and compassion without any of their courage, as if the family's reservoir of bravery had been depleted by the time it reached her generation. She often wondered what her father would think if he could see her now. This timid shadow of the bold little girl who used to demand bedtime stories about brave princesses and fearless adventurers. Would he be disappointed in how easily she had surrendered to fear? Would he recognize any trace of the daughter who had once insisted on wearing a superhero costume to the grocery store because she wanted everyone to know that girls could save the world too? The questions haunted her quiet moments, adding another layer of grief to the complex mixture of emotions she carried everywhere she went. Lincoln High School itself seemed designed to amplify every insecurity. The building was A maze of long corridors and crowded common areas where privacy was impossible, and every interaction felt like a performance. The social hierarchy was clearly defined and ruthlessly enforced, with popular students like Madison Wells ruling their kingdoms from the top, while students like Emma existed in the forgotten territories at the bottom. It was a system that rewarded confidence and punished vulnerability, where showing weakness was like painting a target on your back for anyone looking to boost their own social status. Emma had learned to navigate this environment like a wildlife photographer, trying to observe dangerous animals without being detected. She knew exactly when to arrive at her locker to avoid peak traffic times. She had memorized the schedules of the students most likely to cause her problems, planning her movements around their patterns like a military strategist avoiding enemy patrols. She had identified safe spaces throughout the building where she could retreat when the pressure became too overwhelming, quiet corners and empty classrooms where she could practice the breathing exercises Dr. Martinez had taught her. But despite all her careful planning and defensive strategies, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was living half a life, that the real Emma Collins was trapped somewhere inside this fearful shell, waiting for someone or something to set her free. She remembered having opinions about books and movies, dreams about traveling to distant countries, ideas about how to make the world a better place. All of those thoughts and feelings were still there, buried beneath layers of anxiety and self-doubt, but they felt as inaccessible as treasures at the bottom of the ocean. Her relationship with her mother had become complicated by the weight of unspoken expectations and shared grief. Sarah tried to hide her worry behind encouraging smiles and practical suggestions, but Emma could see the concern in her eyes every morning at breakfast, the way she watched for signs of improvement or decline like a doctor monitoring a patient's vital signs. They both wanted things to go back to the way they were before, but neither of them knew how to bridge the gap between who Emma had been and who she had become. The worst part was the isolation, the sense that she was the only person in the world who understood what it felt like to be afraid of her own voice. She watched other students navigate social situations with an ease that seemed almost magical, forming friendships and expressing opinions and taking risks that would have sent her into a spiral of panic. It was like watching people speak a language she had once been fluent in but had somehow forgotten, leaving her stranded in silence while life continued to happen around her. Sometimes she would lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if this was simply who she was destined to be forever. Maybe some people were meant to be background characters in other people's stories, witnesses to life rather than active participants. Maybe her role was to observe and remember, to bear silent testimony to the experiences of others without ever claiming space for her own experiences and perspectives. But even as these defeated thoughts filled her mind, there was still a small spark of something else buried deep in her chest. It felt like the memory of warmth on a cold day, the faint echo of the girl who had once believed she could do anything. That spark was what got her out of bed each morning and walked her through the doors of Lincoln High, even when every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden safely at home. It was the part of her that still secretly hoped that someday, somehow, she might find her way back to the light. The fluorescent lights in Mrs. Peterson's office cast harsh shadows across the inspirational posters that lined the walls, their cheerful messages about perseverance and self-belief feeling almost mocking in the current circumstances. Emma sat rigidly in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Across the desk, Mrs. Peterson shuffled through a manila folder thick with documentation that represented the steady decline of what had once been a promising academic career. Mrs. Peterson had been the guidance counselor at Lincoln High for nearly 2 decades, long enough to recognize the warning signs when a bright student began slipping through the cracks of the system. She had seen Emma's type before. Intelligent, sensitive kids who possessed all the raw materials for success, but had somehow lost access to their own potential. The challenge was always finding the right combination of support and motivation to help them rediscover their strength before it was too late. Emma, I've been reviewing your academic progress over the past semester, and I'm concerned about some patterns I'm seeing, Mrs. Peterson began, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who had delivered difficult news to countless families over the years. She opened the folder and spread several documents across her desk, like a medical examiner presenting evidence. Your written work continues to be exceptional. Your essay on social justice themes in contemporary literature was one of the best I've seen in years. But your class participation grades are telling a different story. Emma stared at her hands, feeling the familiar flush of shame creeping up her neck. She knew exactly what those participation grades looked like because she had been tracking them obsessively, watching the zeros accumulate like a countdown to some inevitable disaster. Each missed opportunity to speak up in class felt like another nail in the coffin of her academic future, but knowing what she should do and actually being able to do it were separated by a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. In Mr. Williams' history class, you haven't spoken aloud once this entire semester, Mrs. Peterson continued, consulting her notes with the thoroughness of a detective building a case. Mrs. Chen in chemistry says you refuse to participate in lab discussions even when you clearly understand the material better than most of your classmates. And your English teacher, Ms. Foster, tells me you've declined to present any of your creative writing pieces, despite having some of the most insightful perspectives in the class. The words hung in the air like an indictment, each one accurate and damning. Emma wanted to explain that it wasn't a matter of choice, that every time she opened her mouth to speak in class, her throat seemed to close up as if an invisible hand were choking her. She wanted to describe the way her heart would race whenever a teacher looked in her direction, the way her mind would go completely blank the moment attention focused on her, the way shame and fear had become so intertwined that she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. But explaining would require speaking, and speaking was precisely the thing that had become impossible. So she remained silent, confirming every concern that had brought her to this office in the first place. The irony was suffocating. She was failing to advocate for herself in a meeting about her inability to advocate for herself, trapped in a loop of self-defeating behavior that she could see clearly but couldn't seem to escape. Emma's mother, Sarah, had taken the afternoon off work to attend this meeting, sacrificing billable hours that their single-income household could ill afford. She sat beside her daughter like a lawyer preparing to defend a client she loved but didn't entirely understand, her own frustration and worry barely contained beneath a surface of determined composure. Sarah had been fighting this battle alongside Emma for months, trying every strategy she could think of to help her daughter reclaim the confident voice that had once filled their house with laughter and endless questions about how the world worked. "I don't understand what happened," Sarah said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of a parent who had run out of solutions. Emma used to be so engaged, so curious about everything. She would talk my ear off about books she was reading, ideas she was having, plans she was making for the future. She had opinions about everything from local politics to environmental issues. I couldn't get her to stop talking long enough to finish her homework. Mrs. Peterson nodded with the understanding of someone who had witnessed this transformation in countless students over the years. Adolescence can be a challenging time for many young people, especially those who are naturally sensitive and introspective. Sometimes external pressures can cause students to retreat inward as a protective mechanism. The question is how we help Emma find her way back to her authentic self before these patterns become too entrenched to change. The word authentic, struck Emma like a physical blow because it highlighted the central tragedy of her current existence. She felt like she was living as an imposter in her own life, playing the role of a quiet, unremarkable student while her real self remained. Trapped behind layers of fear and self-doubt, every day was an elaborate performance designed to avoid attention, to slip through the system unnoticed rather than risk the vulnerability that came with genuine engagement and connection. The reality is that we're approaching a critical juncture, Mrs. Peterson continued, her tone shifting to convey the seriousness of the situation without crossing into cruelty. Emma's academic performance is still strong enough to keep her in regular classes, but her lack of participation is affecting her overall grades and, more importantly, her preparation for college and beyond. The skills she's avoiding now, public speaking, collaborative problem-solving, intellectual discourse, these aren't optional components of adult life. They're fundamental requirements for success in virtually any field she might choose to pursue. Emma felt the weight of this truth, settling in her chest like a stone. She had been so focused on surviving each day that she hadn't fully considered the long-term consequences of her retreat from engagement. College applications would require interviews. Most careers involved meetings, presentations, and collaborative projects. Even basic social interactions required a level of comfort with expressing herself that she had systematically abandoned over the past year. She was essentially training herself to be unemployable, unmarriageable, and invisible in a world that rewarded confidence and punished silence. "What are our options?" Sarah asked, though the tension in her voice suggested she was bracing herself for answers she didn't want to hear. She had been researching alternative education programs late into the night, reading about online schools and specialized programs for students with social anxiety. Part of her wondered if removing Emma from the traditional school environment might actually be beneficial, allowing her to learn and grow without the social pressures that seemed to be paralyzing her. But another part of her feared that retreat would only reinforce Emma's belief that she was incapable of functioning in the real world. Mrs. Peterson leaned forward, her expression conveying both compassion and resolve. "I believe Emma has the potential to overcome these challenges, but it's going to require active effort and probably some discomfort in the short term. I'm recommending that we implement a structured participation plan, specific, manageable goals that gradually increase Emma's comfort level with speaking up in class. We'll start small, perhaps with written responses that she reads aloud, and build from there." The idea of a participation plan made Emma's stomach clench with anxiety, but she also felt a tiny flicker of something that might have been hope. The prospect of having a clear roadmap, specific expectations, rather than the vague pressure to engage more, actually seemed less terrifying than the current situation where every moment of silence felt like another failure. "However," Mrs. Peterson continued, and Emma could hear the weight of consequence in that single word, "if we don't see meaningful progress by the end of this semester, I'll have to recommend alternative educational options. Not because I don't believe in Emma's abilities, but because the traditional classroom environment may not be the right fit for her current needs. There are excellent online programs and specialized schools that might provide a better foundation for rebuilding her confidence." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword suspended by the thinnest thread. Emma understood that this wasn't a punishment, but rather a recognition that the current situation was unsustainable for everyone involved. She was failing to learn the social and communication skills that would be essential for her future, while simultaneously creating a disruptive dynamic in classrooms where her silence made other students and teachers uncomfortable. Something had to change, and if she couldn't change herself, then her environment would be changed for her. After the meeting, Mother and daughter walked through the parking lot in silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what had just transpired. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. But Emma barely noticed her surroundings. She felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, with her old life behind her and an uncertain future stretching out ahead. The safe isolation she had constructed was crumbling, forcing her to confront the possibility that safety and growth might be mutually exclusive. "I know this is scary," Sarah said as they reached their car, her hand resting gently on Emma's shoulder. "But I also know that you're stronger than you think you are. You've been through difficult things before and found your way through them. This is just another challenge to overcome, not a judgment on who you are as a person." Emma wanted to believe her mother's words, but they felt like a foreign language she had once spoken fluently but could no longer understand. Strength seemed like a luxury that other people possessed, something she had somehow misplaced during the chaos of the past year. But as they drove home through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, she found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, that strength was still there somewhere, buried beneath all the fear and self-doubt, like a seed waiting for the right conditions to grow. That evening, Emma sat at her desk attempting to focus on her homework, but her mind kept wandering back to Mrs. Peterson's words about authentic self and meaningful progress. She pulled out her journal, a leather-bound notebook that had been a gift from her father before he left, and began writing about the person she used to be and the person she wanted to become. The words flowed more easily than they had in months, as if the conversation in the counselor's office had somehow loosened something that had been tightly wound inside her chest. She wrote about the little girl who had fearlessly asked questions in every class, who had organized neighborhood cleanup projects and written letters to the mayor about installing more bike lanes. She wrote about the teenager who had loved performing her poetry, who had dreamed of becoming a journalist or lawyer or teacher, someone whose voice could make a difference in the world. And she wrote about the person she was now, hiding behind her hair and her silence, letting fear make all her decisions and slowly disappearing from her own life. The next morning brought the usual routine of strategic navigation through Lincoln High's corridors, but something felt different. Emma couldn't identify exactly what had changed, but there was a new quality to her awareness, as if she was seeing her environment with slightly sharper focus. Maybe it was the clarity that came with having a deadline, knowing that her current existence had an expiration date that was rapidly approaching. Or maybe it was simply the relief of having her situation acknowledged and named, taking it out of the realm of shameful secret and into the territory of problem to be solved. During lunch period, instead of hiding in the library as usual, Emma found herself drawn to the art hallway, a quieter section of the school where creative energy seemed to make the atmosphere feel less oppressive. She had always appreciated visual art, but had never seriously considered it as anything more than a hobby. Her talents lay in words rather than images, in the precision of language rather than the fluidity of paint or charcoal. But there was something soothing about being surrounded by creativity, by evidence that students at Lincoln High were capable of producing beauty and meaning despite the social chaos that dominated most of the school experience. It was there, standing before a display case filled with student artwork, that Emma first noticed Maya Rodriguez. The younger girl was sitting on the floor beside a large canvas, completely absorbed in adding delicate details to what appeared to be a landscape painting. Her concentration was so complete that she seemed unaware of her surroundings, lost in the meditative process of translating her inner vision onto the physical surface before her. There was something peaceful about her presence, a quality of contentment that Emma hadn't seen in any of her fellow students for months. Maya was small and slight, with dark hair that escaped from her ponytail in soft curls that framed her face. Her clothes were practical rather than fashionable. Jeans with paint stains, an oversized sweater that had clearly seen better days, sneakers that prioritized comfort over style. But there was something beautiful about her complete lack of self-consciousness. The way she moved through the world without seeming to worry about how others might perceive her. Emma envied that freedom, that ability to be fully present in the moment without the constant background noise of social anxiety. The painting Maya was working on depicted a forest scene with light filtering through the canopy in ways that seemed almost magical. Emma could see the careful attention to detail, the way shadows and highlights had been layered to create depth and atmosphere. It was the kind of work that required patience and skill, but also a willingness to trust the creative process even when the outcome was uncertain. Watching Maya work, Emma felt a stirring of something she hadn't experienced in months. Genuine curiosity about another person's inner world and creative process. As she stood there observing, Emma became aware of voices approaching from the main hallway. The tone was aggressive and mocking, the kind of sound that made her instinctively want to find the nearest exit. But Maya seemed oblivious to the approaching danger, still focused entirely on her painting. Emma recognized the voices before she saw their owners. Madison Wells and her usual companions, three girls who moved through the school like a pack of predators looking for suitable prey. Madison was everything Emma was not, confident, popular, and seemingly immune to the self-doubt that plagued most teenagers. She had been student body president for 2 consecutive years, captain of the debate team, and recipient of numerous academic awards. On paper, she was the kind of student that colleges and scholarship committees loved, but Emma had observed her long enough to recognize the cruelty that lived beneath the polished exterior, the way Madison seemed to derive energy from diminishing others rather than building herself up through genuine achievement. Well, look what we have here. Madison's voice cut through the peaceful atmosphere of the art hallway like a blade. Little Maya Rodriguez, making another one of her weird fantasy pictures. Don't you think it's time to grow up and focus on real subjects? Art isn't going to get you into college, especially not community college, which is probably the best you can hope for anyway. Emma watched as Maya's brush froze in mid-stroke, her peaceful expression cracking slightly under the weight of Madison's words. But the younger girl didn't respond, didn't even look up from her canvas. Instead, she seemed to fold inward slightly, as if trying to make herself smaller and less visible. Emma recognized the strategy because she had perfected it herself, the hope that silence and stillness might provide some protection against cruelty. "I'm talking to you, art freak," Madison continued, her voice growing sharper with irritation. "At being ignored. Do you think you're too good to answer when someone's trying to help you? My mother sits on the school board, and she's told me about the budget cuts coming next year. Art programs are always the first to go, which means your little hobby here is living on borrowed time anyway." One of Madison's friends, a tall girl with perfectly straightened blonde hair, laughed at this pronouncement. "Maybe that's for the best. I mean, who needs more weird pictures of forests and flowers? If Maya wants to waste her time on pointless activities, she should at least do it somewhere where the rest of us don't have to see it." Emma felt something stirring in her chest, a familiar sense of injustice that she hadn't experienced since her retreat into silence began. She remembered feeling this way when she witnessed unfairness in movies or read about historical injustices in her textbooks, a burning certainty that someone needed to speak up, that silence in the face of cruelty was a form of complicity. But she also remembered how speaking up had ended for her, the humiliation and shame that had followed her last attempt to use her voice for something meaningful. Madison moved closer to Maya's canvas, her shadow falling across the delicate landscape, and somehow making the colors seem dimmer, You know what your problem is, Maya. You live in fantasy land. You think your little pictures matter, but they don't. Nobody cares about your artistic vision or your creative expression. The real world doesn't have time for dreamers who can't contribute anything useful to society. This final insult seemed to hit its target because Emma saw Maya's shoulders sag slightly, saw the way her grip on the paintbrush loosened as if she were considering abandoning her work entirely. And in that moment, Emma made a decision that surprised her more than anyone else. Instead of retreating to safety, as every instinct demanded, she found herself stepping forward, her heart pounding, but her feet carrying her toward the confrontation, despite every alarm bell going off in her nervous system. Actually, Emma heard herself saying, her voice quiet but clear in the sudden silence that followed her unexpected intervention, "That painting is beautiful. It shows real skill and imagination. Maya has more artistic talent in her little finger than most people develop in a lifetime." The words seemed to hang in the air like a challenge, and Emma felt the full weight of Madison's attention shifting toward her like a searchlight finding its target. She had just violated every rule of survival she had established for herself over the past year, drawing exactly the kind of attention she had worked so hard to avoid. But looking at Maya's startled and grateful expression, Emma found that she didn't regret her decision, even as her pulse raced and her palms grew sweaty with familiar anxiety. Madison turned slowly, a predatory smile spreading across her face, as she recognized the opportunity that had just presented itself. Well, well, well. If it isn't Emma Collins, the girl who can't even order lunch without having a panic attack. Are you seriously trying to give me advice about art? You can't even speak up in class about subjects you actually understand. What makes you think anyone cares about your opinion on anything? The attack was precisely targeted and devastatingly effective, hitting every vulnerable spot that Emma had tried so hard to protect. But instead of crumbling under the assault as she might have done weeks earlier, Emma found herself standing straighter, drawing on reserves of strength she had forgotten she possessed. Maybe it was the sight of Maya's hopeful face, or maybe it was the memory of Mrs. Peterson's ultimatum, or maybe it was simply that she had finally encountered something more important than her own fear. I think Maya's opinion about her own. Art is the only one that really matters, Emma replied, her voice growing steadier with each word. And I think bullying someone for pursuing something they're passionate about says more about the bully than it does about the artist. The words seemed to echo in the hallway, creating a silence that felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Emma had just spoken up, had just defended someone else, had just used her voice for something other than mumbled responses to direct questions. It felt like stepping into sunlight after months of living in shadows, terrifying and exhilarating, and utterly transformative all at once. Madison's smile turned razor-sharp as she processed Emma's unexpected defiance, her eyes glittering with the kind of anticipation that predators show when they've cornered particularly interesting prey. She had been hoping for exactly this kind of reaction, a chance to demonstrate her power in front of witnesses while simultaneously crushing two social outcasts with one devastating blow. The fact that Emma Collins, of all people, had chosen this moment to find her voice only made the opportunity more delicious. "Oh, this is rich," Madison said, taking a step closer to Emma, while her friends formed a loose semicircle behind her, cutting off any easy escape routes. The girl who hasn't spoken above a whisper in months suddenly thinks she's some kind of social justice warrior. Tell me, Emma, what exactly qualifies you to lecture anyone about standing up for themselves? Because last I checked, you ran off a stage crying like a baby and haven't recovered since. The words hit Emma like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum psychological damage. Madison had clearly been storing up ammunition about Emma's humiliation, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy it with surgical precision. But even as shame flooded through her system, Emma found herself thinking about Maya, who was still sitting on the floor clutching her paintbrush, watching this confrontation unfold with wide, fearful eyes. "You're right," Emma said, her voice steadier than she felt inside. "I did freeze up on stage, I did run away crying, and I have been too scared to speak up in class for months. But that doesn't make what you're doing to Maya okay. It just means I understand better than most what it feels like to be attacked for no good reason." Madison's expression flickered for just a moment, as if she hadn't expected Emma to acknowledge her own vulnerabilities so directly. Most people, when confronted with their failures, either denied them completely or crumbled under the weight of shame. But Emma's willingness to own her struggles while still maintaining her position was a tactical move that Madison hadn't anticipated, and it threw her off balance for just long enough to give Emma another moment to speak. "Maya isn't hurting anyone by creating art," Emma continued, finding her rhythm now, the words flowing more easily as she focused on the injustice rather than her own fear. "She's not taking anything away from you or anyone else. She's just trying to express herself and maybe add a little beauty to the world. If that threatens you somehow, maybe you should ask yourself why." The art hallway had grown quiet, except for the sound of Emma's voice and the distant hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Other students had begun to gather at the edges of the confrontation, drawn by the unusual spectacle of quiet Emma Collins standing up to the most feared bully in school. Some of them looked surprised, others seemed impressed, and a few appeared to be documenting the moment with their phones, already anticipating how this story would spread through the social media networks that govern teenage social dynamics. Maya had risen to her feet during the exchange, still holding her paintbrush like a talisman, paint-stained fingers gripping it so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She looked back and forth between Emma and Madison as if watching a tennis match, her expression a mixture of gratitude and terror. It was clear that she wanted to support Emma somehow, but had no idea how to insert herself into a conflict that was rapidly escalating beyond her comfort zone. "You know what I think?" Madison said, her voice taking on the silky tone she used when she was preparing to deliver a particularly devastating blow. "I think you're projecting. You're so desperate to feel better about your own pathetic existence that you're trying to play hero for someone who doesn't even need your help. Maya can speak for herself, can't you, Maya? Or are you just as much of a coward as your new friend here?" The challenge hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Madison had skillfully redirected the confrontation away from the substance of Emma's defense and toward the personal dynamics between the three girls, forcing Maya to either defend herself or confirm Madison's characterization of both girls as weak and ineffective. It was a classic bullying tactic, designed to isolate victims by making them feel that any support they received was actually a sign of their own inadequacy. Maya opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, her face flushing red with embarrassment and frustration. Emma could see the struggle playing out in the younger girl's expression, the desire to stand up for herself, warring with the same kind of paralyzing anxiety that Emma knew all too well. In that moment, Emma recognized a kindred spirit, someone else who possessed thoughts and feelings and opinions, but had learned to keep them locked away for fear of the consequences that might follow their expression. "She doesn't have to prove anything to you," Emma said firmly, stepping slightly in front of Maya in a gesture that was both protective and symbolic. "And neither do I. The fact that you're trying to humiliate a freshman for pursuing art tells me everything I need to know about your character. You're threatened by creativity because you don't have any of your own. You're threatened by people who are brave enough to be authentic because you've built your entire identity around performing for other people's approval." The words came out with a force and clarity that surprised everyone present, including Emma herself. She had just delivered the kind of verbal counterattack that she had imagined countless times in her bedroom mirror, but had never believed she would be capable of executing in real life. It felt like discovering a superpower she hadn't known. She possessed this ability to use language as a weapon for justice rather than a source of vulnerability and shame. Madison's face went through several different expressions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally a cold fury that made her look genuinely dangerous for the first time since the confrontation began. Emma had just challenged her in front of witnesses, had questioned not only her behavior, but her fundamental character, and had done it with enough eloquence to make the criticism sting. This was no longer a simple case of a bully picking on easy targets. It had become a battle for social dominance, and Madison was not accustomed to losing such battles. "You have no idea who you're messing with," Madison said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting would have been. "You think standing up for some weird art kid makes you brave? You think one little speech erases months of being too pathetic to participate in your own life? Let me tell you something, Emma Collins. I know things about you that would make your little performance here look like a joke, and if you don't back down right now, you're going to find out exactly how much worse your life can get." The threat was vague, but unmistakably real, carrying the weight of someone who had the social connections and ruthless determination to follow through on her promises. Emma felt her newly discovered courage wavering under the pressure of Madison's implied retaliation, the familiar anxiety beginning to creep back into her chest like cold water filling her lungs. But then she looked at Maya, who was watching her with something that looked almost like hope, and she realized that this moment was about more than just her own fear or comfort. "I'm not backing down," Emma heard herself saying, the words seeming to come from some deeper part of herself that she was still learning to access. "What you're doing is wrong, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because you're popular or powerful or whatever you think makes you untouchable. Maya deserves to create art without being harassed, and I deserve to speak up without being threatened. If you have a problem with that, then maybe the problem is yours, not ours." The silence that followed this declaration felt electric with possibility and danger. Emma had just drawn a line in the sand, had committed herself to a course of action that would inevitably have consequences she couldn't predict or control. But for the first time in months, she felt like she was living according to her own values rather than simply reacting to her fears. It was terrifying and exhilarating, and completely different from the careful invisibility she had cultivated. Over the past year, Madison stared at Emma for a long moment, her expression unreadable, as if she were calculating odds and possibilities in her head. Then, without warning, she smiled again. But this time the expression held no warmth or humor, only the promise of future retribution. "Fine," she said, her voice artificially bright. "Have it your way, Emma, but don't say I didn't warn you about the consequences of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." With that, Madison turned and walked away, her friends trailing behind her like satellites orbiting a particularly volatile planet. But Emma could see in their backward glances and whispered conversations that this confrontation was far from over. She had just made herself a target, had painted a bull's eye on her back that would make her previous anonymity seem like a luxury she had taken for granted. The thought was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating, as if she had finally stopped waiting for her real life to begin and had instead decided to start living it immediately. As the hallway began to empty and normal conversation resumed, Emma found herself alone with Maya, who was still standing beside her easel with her paintbrush in hand. The younger girl looked at Emma with an expression of wonder and gratitude that made all the fear and uncertainty seem worthwhile, at least for the moment. It had been so long since Emma had felt needed or valued by another person that she had almost forgotten what that kind of connection felt like. "Thank you," Maya said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enormous weight in the space between them. No one has ever done anything like that for me before. I mean, adults sometimes intervene when they see bullying happening, but another student actually choosing to get involved, especially when it means making yourself a target too. That's something else entirely. Emma felt a flush of pride mixed with embarrassment at Maya's gratitude. She wasn't accustomed to being thanked or appreciated, wasn't sure how to respond to praise without deflecting or minimizing her actions. But she also recognized that this was an important moment, a chance to practice accepting acknowledgement for doing something right instead of only focusing on her mistakes and failures. I just couldn't stand watching her tear you down like that, Emma replied, surprised by how natural it felt to have a real conversation with someone her own age. Your painting is genuinely beautiful, and you shouldn't have to defend your right to create art or justify spending time on something that brings you joy. Madison was being cruel for no good reason, and someone needed to say so. Maya smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made her look younger and more optimistic than she had during the confrontation. It means more than you know, she said, gesturing toward her canvas. I've been working on this piece for weeks, and I was starting to doubt whether it was worth finishing. Madison's been making comments about my art all semester, and I was beginning to think maybe she was right. Maybe I was just wasting my time on something pointless. Emma looked more closely at the painting, taking in the subtle details she had missed during the drama of the past few minutes. It really was exceptional work, showing not only technical skill, but also a unique vision and emotional depth that spoke to Maya's talent and dedication. The forest scene seemed to glow with inner light, creating an atmosphere of peace and mystery that drew the viewer into its imagined world. This is incredible, Emma said honestly, studying the careful layering of colors and the way Maya had captured the interplay of light and shadow among the trees. You have a real gift, Maya. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise, especially not someone who's probably never created anything more original than a mean tweet. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them processing what had just happened and what it might mean for their futures at Lincoln High. Emma felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of isolation and fear that had been her constant companion for so many months. Having someone to protect, someone who appreciated her courage rather than judging her failures, felt like discovering water in a desert she hadn't even realized she was wandering through. The bell rang then, signaling the end of lunch period and the beginning of fifth period classes. Emma gathered her backpack, feeling both reluctant to leave this moment of connection and nervous about facing the rest of her day, knowing that Madison was probably already planning her revenge. But as she prepared to head toward her next class, Maya caught her arm gently. "Would you maybe want to sit together at lunch tomorrow?" Maya asked, her voice hopeful but tentative, as if she were prepared for rejection, but brave enough to risk asking anyway. "I usually eat in here while I work on my art, but it might be nice to have some company for a change. Plus, I'd love to hear more about what you think of some of my other pieces." The invitation was simple but profound, representing the possibility of friendship and connection that Emma had given up hoping for. She realized that in defending Maya, she had accidentally begun the process of defending herself as well, creating space for the kind of relationship she had been craving without even knowing it. The prospect of having somewhere to belong, someone to talk to, felt almost too good to be true. "I'd like that," Emma said, meaning it more than she had meant anything in a long time. "I'd like that very much." As they parted ways and headed toward their respective classes, Emma felt a strange new sensation in her chest that it took her a moment to identify. It was hope, she realized, mixed with anticipation and a tiny spark of excitement about what tomorrow might bring. For the first time in months, she was looking forward to something, actively anticipating a positive experience, rather than just trying to survive until the day ended. The rest of her afternoon classes passed in a blur of distracted attention and racing thoughts. Emma found herself replaying the confrontation with Madison over and over, analyzing every word and gesture, marveling at her own courage while simultaneously worrying about the consequences that were sure to follow. She had stepped out of the shadows and into the light, and there would be no going back to her previous invisibility. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. During her final class of the day, English literature with Ms. Foster, Emma found herself actually paying attention to the discussion about character development in To Kill a Mockingbird. The irony wasn't lost on her that they were analyzing Atticus Finch's decision to defend Tom Robinson despite the social pressure and personal danger involved, while she was still processing her own decision to defend Maya despite similar risks. On a much smaller scale, when Miss Foster asked the class to consider what motivates people to take moral stands, even when it's easier and safer to remain silent, Emma felt her hand rising before she had consciously decided to participate. The K gesture felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like speaking a language she had once known fluently but hadn't used in years. "I think," Emma said, her voice carrying clearly through the classroom despite the tremor of nervousness she felt, "that sometimes you reach a point where staying silent becomes more painful than speaking up. When you see something wrong happening and you don't act, you become complicit in that wrongness, and that becomes harder to live with than whatever consequences might come from taking a stand." The classroom fell silent, and Emma could feel every pair of eyes focused on her with varying degrees of surprise and interest. Ms. Foster's expression showed genuine delight at having Emma contribute to the discussion, while several of her classmates looked shocked to hear her voice at all. But instead of feeling exposed and vulnerable as she would have just hours earlier, Emma felt proud of her insight and grateful for the opportunity to share it. "That's a very thoughtful observation, Emma," Ms. Foster said warmly. "Can you elaborate on what you mean by becoming complicit in wrongness through inaction?" Emma took a deep breath, drawing on the confidence she had discovered during her confrontation with Madison. "I think when we see injustice happening and we choose not to intervene, we're essentially giving our approval to that injustice. We're saying that our comfort and safety are more important than doing what's right. And once you recognize that dynamic, it becomes harder and harder to choose silence, because you start to see yourself as part of the problem rather than an innocent bystander." The discussion that followed was one of the most engaging Emma had participated in since starting a high school. Other students built on her comments, sharing their own perspectives on moral courage and the responsibility to speak up for others. Emma found herself contributing several more times, her confidence growing with each successful interaction, her voice becoming stronger and more certain as the period progressed. When the final bell rang and students began packing up their belongings, Ms. Foster approached Emma's desk with a smile that conveyed both surprise and approval. "That was excellent participation today, Emma. I've always known from your written work that you have thoughtful insights about literature and life, but it's wonderful to finally hear you share them aloud. I hope you'll continue contributing to our discussions." Emma felt a warm glow of satisfaction at the praise, remembering how much she had once loved the intellectual stimulation of classroom discussions before anxiety had silenced her voice. "Thank you, Ms. Foster. I'm going to try to participate more regularly. I forgot how much I enjoyed talking about books and ideas with other people." As Emma walked through the hallways toward her locker, she noticed that her posture had changed. Somehow, she was walking taller, making eye contact with other students instead of staring at the floor, occupying space in a way that felt more confident and self-assured. The transformation felt almost magical, as if standing up for Maya had somehow awakened parts of herself that had been dormant for months. But even as she savored this new sense of empowerment, Emma remained aware that Madison's threat was still hanging over her like a storm cloud on the horizon. She had made an enemy of one of the most powerful students in school, someone with the resources and ruthlessness to make her life extremely difficult if she chose to do so. The question was whether Emma's newfound courage would be strong enough to withstand whatever retaliation Madison had in mind. As she gathered her books and prepared to head home, Emma caught sight of Maya at the far end of the hallway, carefully carrying her painting toward the art storage room. Their eyes met across the crowded corridor, and Maya offered a small wave and a grateful smile that reminded Emma why she had chosen to speak up in the first place. Some things, she realized, were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost involved. The walk home gave Emma time to process the events of the day and prepare herself for the conversation she would inevitably have with her mother about what had happened. Sarah would be proud of her for finding her voice and standing up for someone else, but she would also be worried about the potential consequences and the target Emma had painted on her back. It was a complex situation without easy answers, but Emma felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For the first time in months, Emma Collins was no longer just surviving her days at Lincoln High School. She was actively participating in her own life, making choices based on her values rather than her fears, and discovering that courage was not the absence of anxiety, but rather the decision to act in spite of it. The girl who had once frozen on stage was learning to find her voice again, one conversation at a time. The gymnasium of Lincoln High School buzzed with anticipation as students filed into the bleachers for what Madison Wells had promoted as a Unity Day celebration. Colorful banners hung from the ceiling, proclaiming messages of school spirit and togetherness, while a makeshift stage had been erected at the far end of the basketball court. The irony of Madison organizing an event about unity wasn't lost on Emma, who sat nervously in the third row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched the proceedings with growing unease. 3 weeks had passed since Emma's confrontation with Madison in the art hallway, and those weeks had been a strange mixture of triumph and tension. Her friendship with Maya had blossomed into something genuine and meaningful, providing Emma with the kind of connection she had been craving for months. They spent lunch periods together in the art room, where Maya would work on her paintings while Emma helped organize supplies or simply sat nearby reading, both of them enjoying the comfortable companionship that required no performance or pretense. Emma had also continued to find her voice in her classes, particularly in English literature, where Miss Foster had begun calling on her regularly for insights and analysis. The anxiety was still there, a constant flutter in her chest whenever she raised her hand, but it no longer paralyzed her completely. She had learned to work with her nervousness rather than being defeated by it, using the breathing techniques Dr. Martinez had taught her to manage the physical symptoms while focusing on the ideas she wanted to express. But Madison's presence had remained a constant shadow over these positive developments. True to her threat, she had made Emma's life more difficult in subtle but persistent ways. Rumors had begun circulating about Emma's family situation, twisted versions of the truth that painted her as unstable and attention-seeking. Her locker had been vandalized twice, with cruel messages about her stage fright incident, and she had noticed Madison's friends watching her with predatory interest, as if they were gathering intelligence for some future assault. The Unity Day invitation had come as a surprise, delivered to Emma personally by Madison during passing period with what appeared to be genuine contrition. "I've been thinking about our conversation in the art hallway," Madison had said, her voice carrying none of its usual edge, "and I realize I was out of line. I'd like to make amends publicly, show the school that we can resolve our differences like mature adults." Emma's instincts had screamed warnings about the offer, but something deeper in her character had wanted to believe in the possibility of redemption and reconciliation. Maya and several other students had advised her against trusting Madison, pointing out that public apologies were not typically part of the girl's repertoire. But Emma had agreed to participate, partly because she wanted to model the kind of forgiveness and growth she hoped to see in the world, and partly because she feared that refusing would be seen as petty and vindictive. Now, sitting in the packed gymnasium, watching Madison command the stage with her usual charisma and confidence, Emma wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The event had been carefully orchestrated to showcase Madison's leadership qualities, with testimonials from various students about her positive impact on school culture and her commitment to creating an inclusive environment. The whole production felt calculated and artificial, more like a political campaign rally than a genuine celebration of unity. "Before we conclude tonight's festivities," Madison announced into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "I want to address a situation that occurred recently between myself and a fellow student. I believe in taking responsibility for my actions and making things right when I've made mistakes." Emma felt her stomach clench with sudden dread as she realized that hundreds of pairs of eyes were beginning to turn in her direction. Several students in her immediate vicinity were pointing and whispering, having recognized her as the subject of Madison's upcoming remarks. The stage lights seemed blindingly bright, creating the kind of harsh visibility that Emma had spent months trying to avoid. "Emma Collins," Madison continued, gesturing toward Emma's location in the bleachers, "would you please join me up here? I think the school community would benefit from hearing about how we can turn conflict into opportunity for growth and understanding." The request hung in the air, like a trap waiting to be sprung, and Emma felt the familiar panic beginning to rise in her chest. This was exactly the kind of public attention that had destroyed her confidence in the first place. The exposure and vulnerability that her anxiety had been working so hard to help her avoid. But she also recognized that refusing to participate would confirm every negative stereotype about her character and courage, marking her as someone who talked about doing the right thing but lacked the backbone to follow through when it mattered. Emma rose from her seat on unsteady legs, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The walk down the bleacher steps and across the gymnasium floor felt like an eternity, with every footstep echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over the assembled crowd. She could see Maya watching with obvious concern from her seat near the art students, and she drew what strength she could from her friend's supportive expression. As Emma approached the stage, Madison's smile seemed to grow wider and more predatory, though it maintained the appearance of warmth and sincerity that had made her such an effective manipulator throughout her high school career. "Everyone, please give Emma a warm welcome," Madison said into the microphone, generating a round of polite but unenthusiastic applause from the audience. Emma climbed the steps to the stage with as much dignity as she could muster, her legs feeling like they were made of jelly but somehow still supporting her weight. The stage lights were even more intense than they had appeared from the audience, creating a harsh glare that made it difficult to see individual faces in the crowd below. It was uncomfortably reminiscent of the talent show disaster that had triggered her retreat into silence, and she had to consciously resist the urge to flee. "Emma and I had a disagreement recently about the way I was treating another student," Madison began, her voice taking on the measured tone of someone delivering a carefully rehearsed speech. "She felt that I was being unfair and unkind, and she had the courage to confront me about my behavior. I want to publicly acknowledge that she was right to call me out, and I want to apologize for my actions." The words sounded sincere enough, But something in Madison's demeanor suggested that this was merely the opening act of a much more elaborate performance. Emma remained silent beside her, unsure of what response was expected or appropriate, while the audience watched with the kind of fascination that people show when they sense that something dramatic is about to unfold. However, Madison continued, and Emma felt her stomach drop at the word that signaled the real purpose of this public spectacle. I think Emma's journey toward finding her voice is something we can all learn from. As many of you know, Emma has struggled with confidence issues, particularly when it comes to speaking in front of groups. Emma felt the blood drain from her face as she realized where this was heading. Madison was about to weaponize her vulnerabilities in front of the entire school, using her own attempt at redemption as a platform for humiliation and cruelty. The trap had been perfectly baited, and Emma had walked directly into it with her eyes wide open. "I think it would be meaningful," Madison said, her voice dripping with false concern, "if Emma could share with all of us how she found the courage to speak up for what she believed in. But first, I think she should dress appropriately for such an important occasion." That was when Madison's friends appeared from the wings of the makeshift stage, carrying with them a large black garbage bag that they presented to Madison with theatrical flourish. The audience began to murmur and shift in their seats, sensing that they were about to witness something cruel, but unable to look away from the spectacle unfolding before them. "You see," Madison explained to the crowd, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher delivering a lesson, "Emma has made it her mission to dig through other people's business, to root around in situations that don't concern her, like she's searching through trash. So I thought it would be fitting if she dressed the part." Madison held up the garbage bag so that everyone in the gymnasium could see it clearly, the black plastic catching the stage lights and creating an ominous silhouette against the colorful decorations that surrounded them. "Put this on, Emma," she commanded, her voice amplified by the microphone so that her words reached every corner of the building. "Show everyone what it looks like when someone tries to be something they're not." Emma stared at the garbage bag in Madison's hands, feeling the weight of hundreds of expectant gazes pressing down on her like a physical force. This was her nightmare made manifest, the ultimate fusion of public humiliation and powerlessness that her anxiety had been warning her about all along. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee from this stage and never show her face at Lincoln High again. For exactly 35 seconds, Emma stood frozen in place, her mind completely blank with terror and shame. The silence stretched endlessly, broken only by the sound of her own rapid breathing and the restless shuffling of the audience below. She could see Madison's triumphant expression, could feel the mixture of pity and embarrassment radiating from the crowd, could hear the imaginary laughter that would follow her for the rest of her high school career. But then, in that moment of absolute defeat, something extraordinary happened. Emma remembered Maya's grateful smile in the art hallway. She remembered the pride in Ms. Foster's voice when she had contributed to class discussions. She remembered her mother's unwavering belief in her strength and potential. She remembered Dr. Martinez's words about courage being the decision to act despite fear, not the absence of fear itself. And most importantly, she remembered that this moment was not really about her at all. It was about Madison's desperate need to maintain her position in the social hierarchy through the systematic destruction of anyone who dared to challenge her authority. It was about a broken system that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion, that celebrated conformity and silenced authenticity. Emma looked directly at Madison and smiled, a genuine expression of clarity and determination that seemed to catch the other girl completely off guard. "You know what, Madison?" Emma said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone that was still in Madison's hand. "You're absolutely right. I should dress appropriately for this occasion." Emma took the garbage bag from Madison, stunned, and held it up so that everyone in the gymnasium could see it. "This bag," she announced, her voice growing stronger with each word, "represents all the toxic behavior that gets dumped on students in schools like this every single day. It represents the cruelty that people like Madison use to maintain their power over others." The audience had fallen completely silent now, hanging on Emma's every word as she transformed what was meant to be her moment of ultimate humiliation into something entirely different. "But here's the thing about garbage," Emma continued, her confidence building as she found her rhythm. "It only has power over you if you let it pile up without dealing with it. And I'm done letting other people's toxicity define my experience." Emma set the garbage bag down on the stage and stepped away from it, her gesture symbolic and unmistakable. "Madison wanted me to put this on to show everyone what it looks like when someone tries to be something they're not. But I think what we're really seeing here is what it looks like when someone is exactly what they appear to be." She turned to face Madison directly, no longer afraid of the confrontation or its consequences. "You've spent years building your reputation on tearing other people down, convincing yourself that making others feel small somehow makes you bigger. But the truth is, it just makes you empty. It makes you the kind of person who needs a garbage bag to represent their impact on the world." The gymnasium erupted then, not with the laughter and jeers that Madison had been expecting, but with something much more powerful and unexpected. Students began to stand, slowly at first and then in greater numbers, applauding Emma's courage and her refusal to be intimidated. The sound built and built until it became a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Maya was among the first to stand, her face shining with pride and admiration as she clapped with enthusiasm that made up in energy what it lacked in volume. Other art students joined her, followed by kids from Emma's English class who had witnessed her transformation over the past few weeks. Soon, entire sections of the bleachers were on their feet, showing their support for someone who had found the courage to speak truth to power. But the real surprise came when other students began approaching the stage, not to support Madison, but to share their own stories of how her behavior had affected them. A freshman boy talked about being excluded from study groups because Madison had labeled him as too weird. A girl from the drama club described having her confidence destroyed by Madison's constant criticism of her performances. One by one, voices that had been silenced by fear and intimidation began to speak up, creating a chorus of testimony that painted a very different picture of Madison's leadership than the one she had been trying to promote. Emma watched this transformation with a mixture of amazement and profound satisfaction. By refusing to be victimized, she had somehow given permission for others to refuse as well. By speaking her truth, despite the consequences, she had created space for other truths to be spoken. The Unity Day celebration had indeed become an opportunity for the school community to come together, just not in the way that Madison had intended. As the testimonials continued and the evidence of Madison's systematic cruelty mounted, Emma could see the other girls' carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. The confident smile faltered. The practiced charm gave way to genuine panic. And the social media documentation that was undoubtedly taking place would ensure that this moment would be remembered very differently than Madison had planned. But Emma felt no sense of vindictive triumph as she watched her tormentor's public downfall. Instead, she felt a deep sadness for someone who had become so lost in the pursuit of power and status that she had forgotten how to connect with others in any meaningful way. Madison's cruelty was ultimately a symptom of her own insecurity and emptiness, a desperate attempt to fill a void that could never be satisfied through the destruction of others. When the final student finished speaking and the gymnasium began, Too empty, Emma found herself surrounded by classmates who wanted to thank her for her courage and share their own experiences with bullying and intimidation. For the first time since starting high school, she felt like she belonged to a community rather than simply existing on its margins. The connections felt genuine and meaningful in a way that the superficial popularity Madison had cultivated never could. 3 months later, Lincoln High looked and felt like a completely different place. The administration had implemented comprehensive anti-bullying policies based largely on the testimonies that had emerged during the Unity Day event. Madison had been suspended and ultimately transferred to a private school across town, while several of her enablers faced their own consequences for their participation in the systematic harassment of their classmates. Emma had become something she never expected to be, a leader. She ran a weekly support group for students dealing with social anxiety and bullying, sharing the strategies she had learned from Dr. Martinez and creating a safe space for others to practice finding their voices. Her participation in class discussions had become so regular and insightful that teachers frequently used her comments as launching points for deeper exploration of complex topics. Maya's art had gained recognition beyond the confines of Lincoln High, with several pieces selected for display in the regional student exhibition. The friendship between the two girls had deepened into something that felt like family, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than convenience or social positioning. They challenged each other to grow and take risks, celebrating successes together and providing support during difficult moments. But perhaps most importantly, Emma had learned that courage was not a destination, but a practice. Not something you either possessed or lacked, but something you chose to cultivate every single day. Each time she raised her hand in class, each time she spoke up for someone being treated unfairly, each time she chose authenticity over safety, she was exercising muscles that grew stronger with use. The girl who had once frozen on stage had discovered that her voice was not a source of vulnerability, but a tool for change. She had learned that speaking up for others inevitably meant speaking up for herself, that defending what was right required the same courage, whether the stakes were large or small. Most importantly, she had discovered that the fear of being judged would always be there, but it didn't have to control her choices or define her possibilities. As Emma walked through the hallways of Lincoln High on a bright spring morning, she marveled at how different everything looked through the lens of confidence and purpose. The same corridors that had once felt like battlefields now seemed full of opportunity and potential. The same classmates who had once intimidated her with their apparent certainty now looked like fellow travelers on the journey toward adulthood, each struggling with their own fears and insecurities in ways that weren't always visible from the outside. Emma Collins had learned that finding your voice was not about becoming fearless, but about deciding that some things were more important than fear itself. She had discovered that standing up for others was ultimately the same thing as standing up for yourself, and that authenticity was not a luxury for the confident, but a necessity for anyone who wanted to live a meaningful life. The transformation had not been easy or comfortable, but it had been worth every moment of anxiety and uncertainty. Emma had reclaimed her place in the world not by becoming someone different, but by remembering who she had always been underneath, the fear and self-doubt. And in doing so, she had given countless others permission to do the same, creating ripples of positive change that would extend far beyond the walls of Lincoln High School. The girl with the garbage bag had become the girl with the voice, and that voice would continue to speak for justice, compassion, and truth for many years to come. Her story was proof that even the quietest among us possess the power to create extraordinary change when we choose courage over comfort and authenticity over approval. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Lincoln High's main hallway as Emma Collins walked through doors that had once felt like barriers to a prison, but now welcomed her like the entrance to a place where she truly belonged. 6 months had passed since the Unity Day incident that changed everything, and the transformation in both Emma and the school itself was nothing short of remarkable. Students who had once hurried past each other with eyes downcast now made genuine eye contact, offering smiles and greetings that carried real warmth rather than social obligation. Emma's footsteps echoed with confidence as she made her way toward the main office, where a small crowd had gathered around a bulletin board that hadn't existed before her confrontation with Madison Wells. The Voices Matter board had become a central fixture of the school's new culture, covered with testimonials from students who had found the courage to speak up about their experiences, achievements they wanted to celebrate, and ideas for making Lincoln High an even better place for everyone. As she approached, Emma noticed several underclassmen reading the newest additions to the board, their faces showing the kind of hope and possibility that had been notably absent from the school's atmosphere just months earlier. One freshman girl was pointing excitedly at a post about the new peer mediation program, while a sophomore boy was carefully reading through the guidelines for the student advocacy committee that Emma had helped establish. "Emma!" called a familiar voice from across the hallway, and she turned to see Marcus Chen jogging toward her with his characteristic enthusiasm. Marcus was Maya's older brother, a senior who had witnessed the Unity Day transformation and had since become one of Emma's closest allies in implementing positive changes throughout the school. Unlike his quiet, artistic sister, Marcus was naturally outgoing and had used his social connections to help spread the message about standing up for others. "Did you see the latest addition to the board?" Marcus asked, slightly out of breath. From his sprint across the crowded hallway, Mrs. Peterson posted the final numbers for our peer support program, and they're incredible. We've got over 200 students signed up as mentors, and the waiting list for people who want support is actually getting shorter instead of longer. Emma felt a surge of pride and satisfaction as she absorbed this information. The peer support program had been one of her first major initiatives after the Unity Day incident, born from her recognition that many students were struggling with the same feelings of isolation and inadequacy that had nearly destroyed her own high school experience. The program paired older students who had overcome various challenges with younger students facing similar difficulties, creating a network of understanding and guidance that complemented the school's traditional counseling services. "That's amazing," Emma replied, genuinely thrilled by the program's success. "I remember when we first proposed it to the administration, and they were worried we wouldn't be able to find enough students willing to volunteer as mentors. Now look at us. We're actually having to turn people away because we have more mentors than we know what to do with." The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it certainly hadn't been without its challenges and setbacks. In the weeks immediately following Madison's public downfall, there had been a period of uncertainty and adjustment as the school community grappled with the sudden absence of someone who had dominated the social hierarchy for years. Some students had initially struggled to understand how to interact without the clear power structures that Madison's regime had provided, while others had attempted to fill the vacuum by adopting similarly cruel tactics. But Emma had quickly realized that simply removing a bully wasn't enough to create lasting change. The underlying culture that had allowed bullying to flourish needed to be addressed as well. Working closely with Mrs. Peterson, several progressive teachers, and a growing group of student allies, she had begun developing programs and initiatives designed to build empathy, encourage authentic self-expression, and create multiple pathways for students to find belonging and purpose within the school community. The peer support program had been just the beginning. Emma had also helped establish a conflict resolution training course that taught students how to address disagreements and misunderstandings before they escalated into bullying situations. She had worked with the drama department to create an annual showcase where students could share their personal stories through various artistic mediums, providing both cathartic expression for the storytellers and educational experiences for the audience. Perhaps most importantly, Emma had collaborated with the student government to completely restructure how leadership positions were filled and what responsibilities they entailed. Instead of popularity contests that rewarded charisma over character, the new system emphasized service, empathy, and genuine commitment to improving the school experience for all students. Candidates had to complete volunteer hours in the community, demonstrate their ability to work collaboratively with diverse groups, and present detailed plans for addressing specific challenges facing the student body. Speaking of the program, Marcus continued, pulling out his phone to show Emma a series of text messages. "I've been getting messages all morning from students who want to share their success stories. Look at this one from Jessica Martinez. She says working with her mentor helped her find the confidence to audition for the school musical, and she just got cast as the female lead." Emma read through the message, feeling the familiar warmth that came from knowing that their work was making a tangible difference in people's lives. Jessica Martinez had been one of the first students to sign up for the peer support program, a shy sophomore who had been struggling with severe social anxiety that was affecting both her academic performance and her emotional well-being. Her mentor, a senior named David Kim, who had overcome his own challenges with public speaking, had worked patiently with Jessica to develop coping strategies and build her confidence through small, manageable challenges. "And here's another one from Tommy Rodriguez," Marcus continued, scrolling through his messages. He says the anti-bullying workshop we did last month helped him realize that what he thought was just joking around was actually making other kids feel terrible. He's been apologizing to people and trying to change his behavior, and he wants to volunteer for the next workshop to help other students understand the impact of their words. These kinds of transformations had become increasingly common as Lincoln High's culture shifted from one that tolerated or ignored harmful behavior to one that actively promoted kindness, inclusion, and personal growth. Students who had once been passive bystanders to bullying were learning to become active allies, while those who had engaged in harmful behavior were discovering that they could find better ways to build their own confidence and social connections. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message from Maya, who was currently in her advanced placement art class, but wanted to share the news that her latest painting had been selected for inclusion in a statewide high school art exhibition. The painting, a powerful piece depicting students supporting each other through various challenges, had been inspired by the changes happening at Lincoln High and had become a symbol of the school's transformation. Maya's piece made it into the state exhibition, Emma announced to Marcus, who immediately broke into a huge grin. Maya had been like a little sister to both of them over the past months, and watching her artistic talents gain recognition beyond. Their school had been one of the most rewarding aspects of their friendship. The quiet, nervous girl, who had once been afraid to defend her own artwork, was now creating pieces that spoke to universal themes of courage, community, and hope. "That's fantastic," Marcus replied enthusiastically. "She deserves every bit of recognition she gets. Did you know she's been working with some of the elementary schools in the district to teach art classes for kids who can't afford private lessons? She's become quite the teacher herself." Emma hadn't known about Maya's volunteer work with younger students, but the news didn't surprise her. One of the most beautiful aspects of the changes at Lincoln High had been watching how quickly students who had found their own voices began using them to help others do the same. The ripple effects of courage and compassion seemed to expand endlessly, touching lives, far beyond the walls of their school. As they continued walking toward their respective classes, Emma noticed a small commotion near the science wing that immediately caught her attention. A group of students had gathered around someone who appeared to be upset, and Emma's newly developed instincts for recognizing potential problems kicked in automatically. But as they got closer, she realized that what she was witnessing wasn't bullying or conflict, but rather students rallying around a classmate who needed support. The center of attention was Alex Thompson, a junior who had been struggling with his parents' recent divorce and the financial difficulties that had followed. His family's situation had forced him to take on a part-time job that was interfering with his studies, and he had been falling behind in several classes. But instead of mocking him or treating his struggles as entertainment, his classmates had organized a study group specifically designed to help him catch up, with different students volunteering to tutor him in their areas of strength. "This is what I love about this place now," Marcus said quietly as they watched the scene unfold. 6 months ago, someone in Alex's situation would have been seen as weak or pathetic, and people would have either ignored him or made fun of him. Now look, they're treating him like family, like his problems are their problems too. Emma nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction at seeing the values they had worked so hard to promote being lived out naturally by students who had internalized them. The culture change hadn't been imposed from above or mandated through strict rules and punishments. Instead, it had grown organically as more and more students experienced the benefits of treating each other with genuine care and respect. The first period bell rang, and Emma made her way to her advanced placement English literature class, where she had become something of a star pupil under Miss Foster's continued encouragement. The class was currently working their way through a unit on social justice themes in literature, examining how authors throughout history had used their voices to challenge injustice and advocate for positive change. Emma found deep personal meaning in these texts, seeing parallels between the fictional characters' journeys and her own transformation from silent observer to active advocate. "Good morning, everyone," Miss Foster began as the students settled into their seats. "I hope you've all finished reading the assigned chapters of Speak by Laurie Halsey Anderson. I thought we'd begin today's discussion by examining how the protagonist's journey toward finding her voice mirrors many of the themes we've been exploring throughout this unit." Emma's hand shot up immediately, and Ms. Foster smiled with the kind of pride that teachers feel when they see students truly engaging with the material. "Emma, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Melinda's character development." "I think what's so powerful about Melinda's story," Emma began, her voice clear and confident in a way that would have been unimaginable just months earlier, "is how it shows that healing from trauma isn't just about finding the courage to speak up once. It's about learning to value your own voice and trust that what you have to say matters, even when other people try to convince you otherwise." The discussion that followed was rich and nuanced, with students drawing connections between the novel's themes and their own experiences with finding courage in difficult situations. Several classmates referenced the changes that had occurred at Lincoln High, using their school's transformation as evidence that literature's messages about the power of individual action had real-world applications. During lunch period, Emma made her way to the newly established community room, a space that had been converted from an unused classroom into a hub for student-led initiatives and social activities. The room buzzed with activity as various groups worked on their projects. The environmental club planning their next campus cleanup, the debate team preparing for an upcoming tournament, and the creative writing group sharing their latest pieces with each other. Emma had been instrumental in securing this space for student use, arguing successfully to the administration that providing students with opportunities for positive leadership and creative expression would be far more effective. at preventing behavioral problems than simply focusing on punishment and discipline. The community room had become a symbol of the school's new approach to student engagement, emphasizing trust, empowerment, and collaborative problem-solving. "Emma, perfect timing," called out Rachel Stevens, the president of the newly reformed student government. Rachel was a senior who had run for office on a platform of transparency, inclusivity, and genuine service to the student body, representing the new generation of student leaders who had emerged in the wake of Madison's departure. "We just got approval for the peer mentorship expansion program, and we need to start recruiting senior volunteers for next year." The peer mentorship expansion was an ambitious project that would extend their successful high school program to include partnerships with local middle schools, creating a pipeline of support for students during the often difficult transition. From elementary to secondary education, Emma had proposed the expansion after realizing that many of the problems they were addressing at the high school level could be prevented by intervening earlier in students' educational journeys. "That's wonderful news," Emma replied, genuinely excited about the opportunity to expand their impact. "I've already been talking to my mum about the legal requirements for working with younger students, and she's offered to help us navigate the paperwork and liability issues. She's also connected us with a few other parents who work in education and are interested in volunteering their time." Emma's relationship with her mother had undergone its own transformation over the past months, evolving from one characterized by worry and careful monitoring to one built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Sarah Collins had watched her daughter's remarkable growth with amazement and pride, but she had also recognized that Emma's new confidence and leadership abilities represented a fundamental shift in their family dynamic. Instead of trying to protect Emma from the world's challenges, Sarah had begun seeking ways to support her daughter's efforts to make that world a better place. "I've also been thinking about ways to involve the art department in the mentorship and program," Emma continued, her mind already working through the possibilities. "Maya has been doing such amazing work with the elementary students, and I think there's real potential for using creative expression as a bridge between different age groups. Art can be a way for kids to communicate feelings and experiences that they might not be able to put into words yet." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Williams, the school's principal, who had become one of Emma's strongest supporters in the administration. Dr. Williams had initially been skeptical of some of the more ambitious student-led initiatives, concerned about liability issues and the potential for well-meaning programs to create unintended consequences. But the consistently positive results of Emma's various projects had convinced him that empowering students to address their own community's challenges was far more effective than top-down administrative mandates. "Emma, I'm glad I found you," Dr. Williams said, his expression conveying both excitement and slight bewilderment. "I just got off the phone with a reporter from the State Education Department who wants to feature Lincoln High in an article about innovative approaches to school culture and bullying prevention. Apparently, word has gotten out about the changes we've implemented here, and other districts are interested in learning from our experience." Emma felt a mixture of pride and humility at this news. The idea that their work might serve as a model for other schools was both thrilling and slightly overwhelming, representing a level of responsibility and visibility that she was still learning to navigate. But she also recognized that sharing their successes and failures with other communities was an important part of creating broader social change. "I think that's a wonderful opportunity," Emma replied thoughtfully. "But I'd want to make sure that any coverage focuses on the collaborative nature of what we've accomplished here. This wasn't the work of any single person or any single program. It was the result of lots of people deciding to take responsibility for creating the kind of community they wanted to be part of." Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. clearly pleased by Emma's mature response to the recognition. That's exactly the message I hope we can convey. The reporter is particularly interested in the student leadership aspects of our programs, and she specifically asked if she could interview some of the students who have been instrumental in driving these changes. Would you be willing to participate? Emma agreed to the interview, though she insisted that Maya, Marcus, Rachel, and several other student leaders be included as well. She had learned that sustainable change required diverse voices and perspectives, and she wanted any external recognition to reflect the truly collaborative nature of their work. As the day continued, Emma found herself reflecting on how completely her life had changed since that terrifying moment on the Unity Day stage. The girl who had once been paralyzed by the thought of speaking in front of others was now regularly giving presentations to school boards, community groups, and other organizations interested in replicating Lincoln High's transformation. The student who had once felt invisible and powerless was now recognized as a leader whose voice carried real weight and influence. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the sense of belonging and purpose that had replaced the isolation and fear that had defined her earlier high school experience. Emma had discovered that finding her voice wasn't just about overcoming personal anxiety. It was about recognizing her responsibility to use that voice in service of something larger than herself. She had learned that true confidence came not from feeling superior to others, but from knowing that she had something valuable to contribute to her community. The final bell of the day found Emma in the art room with Maya, helping to clean up after the advanced students' work session. Maya was putting the finishing touches on a new piece, a collaborative mural that depicted students from diverse backgrounds working together to build something beautiful. The mural would be installed in the main hallway as a permanent reminder of the values that had come to define Lincoln High's culture. "I still can't believe how much everything has changed," Maya said as she carefully cleaned her brushes, her voice soft with wonder. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a completely different school than the one I started attending as a freshman. The whole atmosphere is just lighter somehow, like people aren't walking around afraid of each other anymore." Emma understood exactly what Maya meant. The transformation had been so gradual and organic that it was sometimes easy to forget how toxic and fearful the school's environment had been before their interventions. Students now moved through the hallways with relaxed confidence, engaging in genuine conversations rather than carefully monitoring their words and actions to avoid becoming targets. Teachers reported higher levels of participation and engagement in their classes, while disciplinary referrals had dropped to historic lows. "It makes me wonder what other changes are possible," Emma mused as she helped Maya organize the art supplies. "If we could transform the culture of an entire school in just 6 months, what else might be achievable if people were willing to work together and speak up for what they believe in?" The question hung in the air between them, filled with possibility and promise. Emma had begun to realize that her experience at Lincoln High was just the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would likely extend far beyond her high school years and into whatever career and life path she ultimately chose to pursue. She had discovered that she possessed both the ability and the responsibility to be a force for positive change in the world, and that realization had fundamentally altered her understanding of her own potential and purpose. As they prepared to leave the art room, Maya turned to Emma with an expression of gratitude that had become familiar over the months of their friendship. "I know I've said this before, but I want to say it again. Thank you for standing up for me that day in the hallway. I know it was scary for you, and I know you didn't have to do it, but your courage gave me permission to find my own courage, and that's changed everything for me." Emma hugged her friend tightly, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that your actions have made a meaningful difference in someone else's life. "Thank you for giving me something worth fighting for," she replied. "I don't think I would have found my voice at all if I hadn't seen you being treated unfairly. Sometimes we need to see injustice happening to other people before we can recognize the injustice in our own lives." As they walked out of the school together, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The girl, who had once been too afraid to order lunch, was now mentoring other students through their own struggles with confidence and self-expression. The student who had hidden in empty classrooms to avoid social interaction was now leading workshops on communication and conflict resolution. The teenager who had felt worthless and invisible had become someone whose voice was sought out and valued by adults and peers alike. But perhaps most importantly, Emma had learned that courage was not a fixed trait that some people possessed and others lacked. Instead, it was a choice that had to be made over and over again, in small moments and large ones, whenever the opportunity arose to stand up for what was right or speak up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. She had discovered that her voice was not just a tool for her own self-expression, but a gift that could be used to amplify the voices of others and create space for stories that might otherwise go unheard. The transformation of Lincoln High School stood as proof that even the most entrenched systems and cultures could be changed when people chose courage over comfort, compassion over cruelty, and authentic connection over superficial popularity. Emma Collins had learned that finding her voice was not a destination, but a daily practice, and that the most powerful way to use that voice was in service of creating a world where everyone felt safe, valued, and free to be authentically themselves. The shy girl, who had once stood frozen with a garbage bag in her hands, had become a young woman whose voice could move mountains, one conversation at a time. And her story was proof that sometimes the quietest people have the most important things to say, if only someone will create the space for them to say it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.